It was a cold Monday morning when Marcus Hayes faced his first real challenge in the department. The night before, he had been out on patrol, working with Officer Sanchez, who had been one of the few officers who seemed genuinely dedicated to the job. While they were on duty, a call came through about a minor traffic accident in a rundown neighborhood. Marcus knew the area well, and he could already sense that trouble might be brewing. As soon as he and Sanchez arrived on the scene, they saw a group of officers already present. Among them was Sergeant Don Simmons, standing with his arms crossed, his usual smirk on his face. Marcus had a feeling this wouldn't be a routine call. Simmons, as usual, wasn't interested in solving the problem fairly. He was more interested in making the situation more difficult than it needed to be. A man who appeared to be in his mid-30s, dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans, stood by the car involved in the accident. The man looked nervous, clearly shaken by the incident, but he wasn't causing any trouble. However, Marcus noticed Simmons stepping forward with a look of annoyance. "Hey, you." Simmons barked at the man. "What's the matter with you? Can't drive like a normal person." The man stammered, trying to explain that the accident was not his fault. He mentioned that his car had suddenly stopped working, and he couldn't avoid the crash. Marcus could see the genuine fear in the man's eyes. It was clear that he wasn't in the best financial situation, and it was obvious that he felt out of place in this situation, surrounded by uniformed officers. But Simmons wasn't listening. He kept pushing the man, asking him sarcastic questions, and making jokes about how he didn't belong in this neighborhood. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had seen this type of behavior before in other parts of the country, but it hurt to see it happening right in his own town. "Hey, Marcus," Simmons called out, mocking Marcus's name. "Why don't you take care of this guy? You're the new guy, right? Show us how it's done." Marcus took a deep breath. He knew Simmons was trying to provoke him, but he wouldn't give in. He stepped up calmly and addressed the man, trying to reassure him. "Don't worry. We're going to sort this out. Just stay calm." He turned to Simmons and the other officers who were standing by, watching the scene unfold. "Let's treat him with respect and make sure we handle this properly." Simmons laughed out loud, his group of officers chuckling along with him. "Respect. You're new here, Hayes. This is how things are done." Marcus didn't back down. "That's not how it should be done," he said firmly. "We're here to help, not to make people feel worse." At that moment, Marcus realized just how much work he had ahead of him. He could feel the resistance in the air, the reluctance to change, but he knew he had to keep his calm and stand his ground. The officers around him might not like it, but he was going to change the way things were done. As the situation was resolved, with no charges against the man, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. He had to be smart and patient. The true test of his strength and leadership was just starting, and he was determined to show everyone that respect and fairness would come first under his command. The days following Marcus's confrontation with Sergeant Simmons were tense. His decision to stand up to Simmons and defend Malik had sent shockwaves through the department. Marcus knew that he had made enemies, but he also felt a sense of pride. He had done what was right, even though it had put him in a difficult position. Now, it was time for the truth to come out. A week later, during the annual police department meeting, Marcus was called into the conference room with all the officers present. The room was filled with familiar faces, some of whom he had worked with during his time undercover, and others he had yet to get to know. It was an intimidating setting, and Marcus could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. As he walked into the room, he kept his posture straight and his expression calm. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances. No one knew what to expect. Sergeant Simmons was standing at the front of the room, his arms crossed, wearing a smug expression. He looked like he was ready to take control, but Marcus had other plans. The room quieted as the chief of police, the former head of the department, stepped forward. He had no idea about the changes that had been happening behind the scenes. He welcomed the officers and began speaking about the challenges facing the department. As he spoke, Marcus stayed quiet, his mind focused on what was about to happen. Then, without warning, Marcus stood up. The room went silent as all eyes turned to him. With a steady voice, he addressed the officers. "I'm not here to speak as just another officer. I'm here to speak as your new chief of police," Marcus said, his voice clear and unwavering. The shock in the room was immediate. Officers stared at him in disbelief. Marcus could feel the tension rise as Sergeant Simmons's face turned red. He had no idea that Marcus, the officer he had been mocking, was actually his new boss. "I know many of you are shocked," Marcus continued. "You didn't know who I was when I started, and I wanted it that way. I needed to see what was really happening in this department." There was a hushed silence. Marcus could feel the eyes of every officer on him, some filled with surprise, others with suspicion. But he stood tall, unwavering in his determination. "For weeks, I've watched as certain officers have abused their power. I've seen the racism, the mistreatment, and the lack of respect for the people we are supposed to serve," Marcus said, his voice firm but measured. "And I won't stand for it any longer." Sergeant Simmons shifted uncomfortably, his face a mix of anger and confusion. He hadn't expected this. He had thought Marcus was just another officer who would fall in line like the rest. But Marcus wasn't like them. "I've seen enough," Marcus continued. "Starting today, we will begin a new chapter. We will work toward rebuilding the trust of the community, and we will hold everyone here accountable for their actions. No one is above the law, not even those who wear this uniform." The room was filled with silence. Some officers exchanged uneasy looks, while others seemed to consider Marcus's words. It was clear that Marcus was serious about change, and his words carried weight. "I know this won't be easy," Marcus said, his voice softening. "But together, we can make this department a place where integrity and fairness are the core values. I'm not here to make enemies. I'm here to make things right." With that, Marcus took his seat. The tension in the room remained thick, but for the first time, there was a sense of change in the air. The officers knew that things would never be the same again. Marcus had made his stand, and he was ready to lead the way to a better future for the department. Sergeant Simmons, who had expected to be the one in control, now realized that he was no longer the one calling the shots. Marcus had just taken his first step toward transforming the department, and the officers knew that he was serious about holding them all accountable. Marcus Hayes started his undercover role at the police department with a calm and focused mindset. He wanted to understand the environment from the inside, but what he discovered in just a few days shocked him. The department was full of bad habits, favoritism, and a lack of respect for the very people they were supposed to protect. Sergeant Don Simmons, one of the senior officers, stood out the most. Simmons acted like the department was his personal playground. He led a group of officers who followed his every word, laughing at his bad jokes and joining in on his unfair treatment of others. Simmons made it clear early on that he didn't like Marcus. He often sneered at Marcus during briefings and gave him assignments nobody else wanted to take. "You're new, Hayes," Simmons said one morning with a smirk. "You get the night patrol in the toughest neighborhood. Let's see if you can handle it." Marcus didn't argue. He accepted the assignment without complaint, even though he knew it was meant to intimidate him. He wasn't afraid of the work. He had seen much worse during his career. Instead, he focused on observing how the department operated. It wasn't just Simmons who caused trouble. Many of the officers followed his lead, copying his behavior. They spoke to certain members of the community with disrespect and treated others as if they were beneath them. Marcus noticed that they often made unfair assumptions about people based on their appearance or background. It made him angry, but he kept his emotions in check. He knew he had to stay calm and strategic. One evening during his patrol, Marcus overheard Simmons and his group talking in the break room. They were joking about people they had pulled over, making fun of their accents and appearances. Marcus clenched his jaw, but didn't say anything. He knew his time to act would come soon, but first, he needed to gather more information. Not everyone in the department was like Simmons, though. Marcus noticed a few officers who seemed uncomfortable with what was happening. One younger officer, Officer Jenna Torres, rarely laughed at Simmons' jokes. She often stayed quiet and focused on her work. Marcus saw potential in her and hoped she could be an ally when the time came to make changes. The more Marcus observed, the more he realized how deep the problems ran. The officers who tried to do their jobs with fairness and respect were often pushed aside, while those who joined in on Simmons' behavior were rewarded with easier shifts and better treatment. It was a system designed to protect the wrong people. Despite the challenges, Marcus remained patient. He took note of every incident, every unfair comment, and every moment of disrespect. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but he also knew that he was in the right place to make it happen. As the days passed, Marcus prepared himself for the battles ahead. He wasn't just an officer here to follow orders. He was the future chief of police, and soon, everyone in the department would find out exactly who he was. Marcus Hayes had been working undercover for several weeks now, quietly gathering information and understanding the culture of the police department. He had seen enough to know that change was needed. The officers, especially Sergeant Don Simmons and his followers, were comfortable with their power and privilege, making the department toxic for anyone who didn't fit their idea of how things should be. But Marcus wasn't about to back down. He knew he had to wait for the right moment to make a stand. That moment came one late evening when Marcus was called to a scene involving a young black teenager, Malik, who had been caught up in a minor situation. Malik was walking down the street when two officers, including Simmons, stopped him. They told him he fit the description of someone they were looking for, even though Malik was just heading home from a friend's house. As soon as Marcus arrived at the scene, he could see that the situation was already escalating. Simmons was standing in front of Malik, barking orders at him in an aggressive tone. The teenager, clearly frightened, was trying to explain that he had done nothing wrong, but Simmons wasn't listening. "Stay quiet and don't move," Simmons snapped at Malik. Marcus watched from a distance, his blood beginning to boil. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He knew he couldn't stand by and let this continue. As much as he had tried to keep a low profile, it was time to act. He walked forward, calmly but firmly. "Sergeant Simmons, that's enough," Marcus said, his voice steady, but with a clear authority behind it. Simmons turned, surprised to see Marcus standing there. "What's your problem, Hayes? This kid's trouble. We're doing our job." But Marcus wasn't having it. He stepped closer to Malik, his hand raised in a gesture to calm the teenager down. "You're not doing your job, Sergeant," Marcus replied. "This young man hasn't done anything wrong. Let him go." The officers around them looked confused, unsure of what to do. They were used to following Simmons without question. But Marcus stood his ground. His eyes locked on Simmons, who now looked like he was about to explode. "Who do you think you are, Hayes?" Simmons asked, his voice rising. "You're just a rookie here, and you're telling me how to do my job." "I'm telling you what's right," Marcus said firmly. "You're wrong. This kid is innocent, and I'm not going to let you treat him like this." The tension in the air was thick. Marcus could feel the eyes of the other officers on him, waiting to see what would happen next. Simmons glared at him, his anger obvious, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had reached his breaking point, and there was no going back now. Finally, Simmons stepped back, clearly annoyed but unwilling to escalate things further. He muttered something under his breath and waved the officers to move on. Malik, still shaking, looked at Marcus with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Thank you," Malik whispered. Marcus nodded, offering him a reassuring smile. "It's the least I can do." As the situation calmed down and the officers left, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning of the changes he needed to make. He had made a stand, but there were still many more battles ahead. The officers like Simmons weren't going to back down easily, but Marcus was ready. He knew that things were about to get even more challenging, but he was prepared to face whatever came next. The meeting had set the tone for what was to come, But Marcus knew that words alone weren't enough. Action was necessary, and it needed to happen quickly. As the new chief of police, he had made his intentions clear, but now he had to prove he meant what he said. It was time to start cleaning house. The very next day, Marcus gathered the department's leadership team for a meeting. He needed to get the right people on his side if the changes were going to stick. As they entered the room, some officers looked nervous, while others seemed more resistant. Marcus wasn't surprised by the reactions. He knew that it would take time to break down the old culture, but he was ready for the challenge. "Listen up," Marcus began, his tone calm but firm. "We're at a turning point. The way we've been doing things, the way some of you have been treating the community, those days are over. From now on, every officer will be held accountable for their actions." He looked directly at Sergeant Don Simmons, who had been silent so far. Simmons had always considered himself untouchable, but now he could feel the change coming. Marcus could see the tension in Simmons's eyes. Simmons was one of the main reasons the department had become so corrupt, and Marcus knew that he had to make a strong example of him. "We're starting with immediate suspensions for officers who have been involved in misconduct," Marcus announced. "This includes everyone who's been part of the problem. No one gets special treatment." Simmons shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had expected Marcus to take a more gradual approach, but Marcus was moving quickly. It was clear that he wasn't just going to talk about change. He was going to make it happen. Marcus continued, "I'm also implementing new training for all officers on racial sensitivity, community relations, and ethical conduct. These are non-negotiable. If you're not willing to learn, then you're not part of this team." The room was silent. Some officers were clearly upset, while others seemed to accept the reality of the situation. Marcus could feel the resistance, but he stood tall. He wasn't going to let the old guard hold him back. He was committed to building a police force that the community could trust again. The following week, Marcus began reviewing the department's internal investigations, looking for patterns of corruption, favoritism, and racial bias. It didn't take long to find troubling evidence. Officers who had been with the department for years had been covering for each other, letting misconduct slide, and failing to address complaints from the community. Marcus called in the officers involved and began making his decisions. Some were suspended indefinitely, pending further investigation. Others were reassigned to less critical roles while they underwent retraining. But it wasn't just about punishment. It was about rebuilding the department from the ground up. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Many of the officers who had been part of the problem would resist, and some would even try to sabotage the changes. But Marcus was determined to hold his ground. He believed in fairness and justice, and he was ready to fight for it, even if it meant losing allies along the way. In the days that followed, the community began to notice the changes. The police officers who once walked through the streets with arrogance and entitlement were now showing more respect to the people they served. It was clear that Marcus's leadership was making a difference, but the real work had only just begun. As the weeks went by, Marcus stayed focused. He knew that cleaning up the department would take time, but he was committed to seeing it through. The officers who had chosen to stay with the department would have to prove themselves, and those who didn't share his vision of change would be shown the door. Marcus was building a new foundation, one where trust, respect, and fairness were the core values. It wouldn't be easy, but Marcus was ready for the long fight ahead. As Marcus Hayes took on the challenge of reforming the police department, he knew that the work ahead was immense. The officers who had been part of the old system, led by Sergeant Don Simmons, didn't want to change. They resisted at every turn, testing Marcus's patience. But with each passing day, Marcus found more reasons to stay hopeful. The first signs of progress began to show when some of the officers who had been quietly observing the changes started to speak out. Officer Jenna Torres, who had always treated people with respect, became one of Marcus's strongest allies. She had seen the unfairness in the department, and now, with Marcus in charge, she felt like she had a chance to make a difference too. Jenna and Marcus worked together to organize the first round of mandatory training for all officers. The sessions covered everything from racial sensitivity to the importance of community policing. Marcus made it clear that this wasn't just a formality. He expected everyone to take it seriously. There were many officers who still resisted, but Jenna and a few others led by example, showing that change was possible and necessary. The first day of training was a bit rocky. Some officers rolled their eyes, clearly uninterested, while others openly complained about the new direction. But Marcus wasn't discouraged. He knew that changing the mindset of an entire department wouldn't happen overnight. Still, he remained focused, patiently guiding the training and encouraging the officers who were willing to learn. As the days went on, there was noticeable improvement. Officers who had once treated the community with disrespect began to engage more thoughtfully with people. They started asking questions, offering help, and listening to concerns. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The community began to notice, too. They saw the changes in how they were treated by the officers, and slowly, the trust that had been broken started to be rebuilt. One afternoon, Marcus walked through a neighborhood that had once been a hotspot for tension between the police and the community. As he passed by a group of local residents, one of them, an older woman, stopped him. She looked at him for a moment, sizing him up, before giving him a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she said simply, "for listening to us, for making things better." Marcus smiled back, feeling a sense of pride. It wasn't just about the department. It was about the people he served. He was starting to see the difference his leadership was making, and it fueled his determination to keep going. Later that week, Marcus held a community meeting where residents could speak directly to him and other officers about their concerns. It was a difficult meeting, with some people expressing frustration and anger over the years of mistreatment. But Marcus listened carefully, acknowledging their pain and assuring them that change was underway. He didn't make any promises he couldn't keep, but he made it clear that he was committed to rebuilding trust. Jenna stood by Marcus throughout the meeting, offering support and helping to calm the crowd when tensions rose. As the meeting ended, Marcus could see the beginnings of something new, a partnership between the police and the community, built on mutual respect and understanding. The road ahead was still long. There were many more challenges to face, and not all the officers were on board with the changes. But Marcus knew that the seeds of progress had been planted. It wouldn't happen overnight, but with determination and patience, he could lead the department to a place where it was truly serving and protecting everyone, no matter their background. As Marcus left the meeting, he glanced at Jenna and gave her a nod of approval. "We're getting there," he said, "one step at a time." Jenna smiled, a sense of hope shining in her eyes. "We're making a difference, Chief." It wasn't perfect yet, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like they were on the right path. A new beginning had started, and he was determined to see it through. Months had passed since Marcus Hayes took charge as the chief of police, and the department had started to change in ways that were impossible to ignore. The road hadn't been easy, and Marcus knew that the path to full transformation was still long. But as he looked around, he saw that the work was paying off. Officers were beginning to respect each other. The community was starting to trust the police again, and most importantly, the department was starting to live up to its responsibility to serve and protect everyone fairly. The biggest test for Marcus was ensuring that the change lasted. He couldn't afford to let the progress slip away, so he continued to stay involved with every aspect of the department. He worked closely with the officers who had supported him from the beginning, like Officer Jenna Torres, and made sure that the ones who resisted change either adapted to the new way of doing things or left the force. One day, Marcus took a walk around the precinct with Jenna. They stopped to chat with officers on duty, and he was pleased to see how much the atmosphere had improved. There were fewer tense faces and more conversations about real issues, not just the usual complaints. "I've seen a huge difference," Jenna said as they walked through the hall. "People are actually talking to each other now. It's like we're a team instead of just separate parts." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It's about trust. We've rebuilt a little bit of it, But we can't stop here. We have to keep earning it, every day. He could sense that things had changed, but he also knew that these changes were fragile. It wasn't enough for just him or a few good officers to lead the way. The entire department had to embrace a new culture. Marcus had always believed that leadership wasn't about power, it was about service. And now he was teaching that lesson to every officer under his command. A few weeks later, Marcus held a ceremony to honor the officers who had shown exceptional commitment to the changes. He called it a celebration of service, but it was more than just a simple acknowledgement. It was a recognition of how much the department had come together and how far they had come. The room was filled with applause as Marcus presented awards to those who had stepped up, particularly those who had shown leadership in rebuilding relationships with the community. Officers like Jenna, who had stood by Marcus through thick and thin, were recognized for their courage and dedication. But as Marcus stood on stage, he couldn't help but think of the people who had supported him all along: his family, his mentors, and the people from the community who had trusted him to make a difference. They had all played a part in his success, and he knew he couldn't have done it alone. As the ceremony came to a close, Marcus looked around the room at the officers who had chosen to stay and embrace the change. They were no longer the same group of officers he had joined months ago. They had grown into a team that cared about each other and the people they served. Marcus smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. This was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. A department that wasn't just about enforcing the law, but about leading with respect, integrity, and fairness. The next generation of officers would learn from him. They would understand that true leadership came from within, and that their duty was not only to enforce the law, but also to serve with honor. As Marcus left the stage that day, he knew his work wasn't done. The community would always need protection, and there would always be challenges ahead. But as long as he stayed true to his mission, he knew that the department would continue to evolve for the better. With a final glance at the officers in the room, Marcus felt confident that the changes he had started were here to stay. He had made a difference, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Marcus Hayes grew up in a small town with big dreams. From a young age, he had a strong sense of justice. He saw how unfairly people in his community were treated, especially those who looked like him. This made him determined to change things when he grew up. Marcus worked hard to become a police officer. He didn't just want to wear the uniform. He wanted to make a real difference. Over the years, he gained experience, earned awards, and built a reputation as a fair and strong leader. He served in big cities where he faced many challenges, but he always stayed true to his principles. Now Marcus was coming back to his hometown. Things had not improved since he left. The police force had a bad name, and people didn't trust them. Some officers were rumored to be using their power in unfair ways, especially toward minorities. Marcus had been chosen as the new chief of police to fix the department. But Marcus had a plan before he officially stepped into his new role. He wanted to see what the police department was really like when no one was watching. To do this, he decided to join the force as a regular officer without telling anyone he was their new chief. He wanted to understand the problems from the ground level and find out who was part of the problem and who could be part of the solution. The day Marcus started his undercover role, he walked into the station wearing a simple uniform, blending in with the other officers. He introduced himself politely, but he could feel the tension in the room. Some officers greeted him with fake smiles, while others didn't even bother to hide their dislike. Despite the cold welcome, Marcus stayed calm. He listened more than he spoke, observing how the officers interacted with each other and with the public. It didn't take long for him to notice that some of the senior officers, especially Sergeant Don Simmons, seemed to enjoy making fun of others. Simmons acted like he owned the place, and Marcus could tell he wasn't a man who followed the rules. Marcus quickly realized that Simmons and his group of close friends were the ones who controlled the culture in the department. They laughed loudly at jokes that weren't funny, handed out the hardest tasks to new officers, and seemed to take pleasure in putting others down. Marcus pretended not to notice when they tried to test him. They gave him the worst shifts and made snide comments about his background. But Marcus wasn't the type to get angry easily. Instead, he used this time to learn. As the days went on, Marcus kept his head down and his ears open. He had a mission, and nothing was going to distract him. Little did the officers know, the man they were mocking was about to become their leader, and their worst nightmare if they didn't clean up their act. Over the next few weeks, Marcus Hayes continued his undercover role at the police department. Each day, he learned more about the officers around him and how deeply the problems ran within the force. He kept his head down, following orders, while quietly observing the actions and attitudes of his colleagues. His patience was being tested, but Marcus knew that it would take time to understand everything fully before he could make any big moves. While some officers, like Sergeant Don Simmons, made their negative views loud and clear, others were more subtle. There was a certain unease in the department whenever Marcus was around. He could sense the tension, as if his calm presence made some of the officers nervous. Perhaps they knew deep down that something wasn't right, but they were too afraid to speak up. Marcus spent a lot of time watching how his fellow officers treated the community. He saw how they interacted with different people, those who lived in wealthier parts of town and those from poorer neighborhoods. It was clear to him that there was a difference in how the officers treated them. People who came from certain backgrounds or had certain appearances were treated with more respect, while others were looked down upon. One afternoon, Marcus found himself on a routine patrol with Officer Jenna Torres. She was quiet, but Marcus had noticed that she didn't fit in with the rest of the department. While others laughed at Simmons' jokes and followed his lead, Jenna kept her distance. She focused on her work and was polite to everyone she met, regardless of their background. During their shift, they responded to a call about a suspicious person near a local store. It turned out to be a teenager who had been hanging around the area because he was waiting for his sister, who was working inside. The young man had done nothing wrong, but one of the officers with them, Officer Brooks, started questioning him aggressively. "You look like trouble," Officer Brooks said. "What are you doing here? Who are you waiting for?" The young man, clearly nervous, tried to explain that he was just waiting for his sister to finish her shift, but Brooks didn't believe him. Marcus watched the interaction carefully, noting how the young man seemed scared, as if he had been treated this way before. Jenna, who had been silent up until then, finally stepped forward. "He's just waiting for his sister," she said firmly. "There's no reason to treat him this way." Marcus could see Jenna was trying to do the right thing, standing up against the unfair treatment. He admired her courage, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy for her in a department like this. It took strength to speak up, and many of the other officers might see her actions as troublemaking. As the situation settled, Marcus made a mental note to keep an eye on Jenna. He knew she had a strong sense of justice, just like him. But he also understood how dangerous it could be to stand up against the status quo, especially in a department where most officers chose to stay quiet or go along with the bad behavior. Marcus continued his silent observations, gathering information for the future. He knew that change was coming, but it was going to be a long and difficult journey. For now, he would keep his head low and build connections with the right people. He could already feel that a storm was coming, and when the time was right, he would be ready to lead the charge for change.